Aviana Wren had only been working at Ridgemont Industries for a few weeks when she first felt the weight of the company's late-night demands. It was nearly midnight, and the gleaming corridors were deserted. The overhead lights buzzed quietly, illuminating an office that could house hundreds of employees during the day but now seemed like a city of darkened windows. She had been about to leave when she noticed a single source of light glowing beneath the door of her boss's office. She hesitated, but her curiosity, and her sense of responsibility, pushed her to knock. Langston Harlow's office was spacious and modern, reflecting both the wealth and refined taste of the company's CEO. He was known throughout the financial world as a brilliant dealmaker, a man who had taken a small investment fund and turned it into a billion-dollar empire. For Aviana, still on probation as a junior associate in the corporate development team, it was both exhilarating and intimidating to be in the same space with him at such an hour. As she entered, she found him standing by a wide glass window that overlooked the city's skyline. He looked focused, with sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, and a stack of documents spread across his desk. He greeted her calmly, as though it were perfectly normal to keep an employee so late. She sensed that something important was happening, numbers on the screen behind him, confidential memos piled on a side table, the tension in the air. His request was simple: he needed help preparing materials for an urgent meeting the next day, and Aviana was the only person left in the building who might be able to assist. She had heard stories about executives who worked employees to the bone, but Langston's approach was different. He was direct, polite, and unexpectedly genuine as he described what needed to be done. Though Aviana was exhausted, she felt a spark of pride. This was her chance to prove herself in front of the company's most influential figure. They spent hours reviewing data, editing slides, and rehearsing critical talking points. At one point, the overhead lights flickered, and Aviana realized how late it truly was. When the clock crept toward 2 in the morning, Langston suggested they take a short break. He opened a sleek silver cabinet and pulled out a small coffee maker, offering her a cup. The two of them ended up sitting on the corner of his massive desk, steaming mugs in hand. Aviana's heart pounded, but she tried to steady her voice as they started chatting about more personal things: where she grew up, why she had chosen finance, and what her dreams were before she landed this competitive position. Langston listened attentively, occasionally sharing bits of his own background. She found herself drawn to the quiet intensity in his eyes and the kindness that existed behind his sharper edges. The conversation broke down the usual barriers. Aviana stopped feeling like a low-level employee and began seeing Langston as a man full of drive and hidden vulnerability. Each moment of shared laughter felt shockingly intimate in the hush of the empty skyscraper. She noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere when he placed his hand just a bit too close to hers on the desk. At first, she convinced herself it was accidental. But then he didn't move his hand away, and she found she didn't want to pull hers back either. Neither could say who initiated it. Their gazes locked, and all the formalities, the "Mr. Harlow," and the respectful distance, simply vanished. Perhaps it was the adrenaline of working against an impossible deadline, or maybe the loneliness of city nights, but that spark ignited. Their kiss was sudden and urgent, fueled by mutual curiosity and pent-up tension. Aviana felt her heart race as she realized that this was not just a casual, fleeting impulse. Despite knowing the possible complications, neither found the willpower to stop. They spent the remainder of that night together in Langston's office. The city lights illuminated the large windows, and their conversation and laughter faded into something deeper and more intimate. It was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. By the time morning began to lighten the horizon, Aviana had drifted in and out of restless sleep, her mind swimming with questions about what she had just done and what it could mean for her future. When the workday staff began to trickle in, Aviana dressed quickly and left. She couldn't bear the thought of being spotted sneaking out of the CEO's office at the crack of dawn. As she stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers descend, her pulse hammered in her ears. She had crossed a line most people never approached. The weight of that realization pressed down on her as the doors slid open into the bustling lobby. Langston, for his part, composed himself for a series of morning meetings as if nothing unusual had occurred. But Aviana couldn't ignore the memory of his voice whispering to her in the dim light. She spent the day torn between duty and a sudden, all-consuming secret. They parted ways without a spoken agreement, yet both understood something irreversible had happened. Neither knew then that it would come back into their lives in a way that would change everything. In the days that followed, Aviana tried to refocus on her tasks at Ridgemont Industries, determined to treat that night in Langston's office as a momentary lapse in judgment. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, nor could she banish the warmth that had coursed through her when they were alone. Despite her best efforts to push aside these thoughts, she found herself growing unusually tired. She dismissed the first wave of morning nausea as a product of stress. After all, she was new to the company, juggling responsibilities that often kept her in the office well past normal hours. However, the persistent queasiness became harder to explain away. She reached a point where simply climbing a flight of stairs left her short of breath. One afternoon, after sitting through a lengthy departmental briefing, she felt lightheaded enough to worry she might faint in front of her colleagues. Her supervisor, a stern-faced woman named Celia Fallon, took note of Aviana's pallor and insisted she take the rest of the day off. Aviana reluctantly agreed, aware that she couldn't keep up the facade of perfect health forever. On her way home, she made a discreet stop at a pharmacy, her heart pounding as she picked up a pregnancy test. A small part of her hoped it was all in her head, that it was nothing more than work-related exhaustion. When she finally worked up the courage to use the test, she paced her tiny bathroom, the silence around her broken only by the drip of the faucet. Those few minutes stretched out like an eternity. The result was clear and undeniable, positive. She stared at the indicator, her mind blank at first, and then suddenly filled with 1,000 questions. She sank onto the edge of her bathtub, cheeks growing hot with a rush of panic. She could still see Langston's face in her mind, the way he had looked at her in that quiet moment before dawn. Now there was no escaping what it meant. A wave of fear rolled through her as she contemplated her next steps, her future, and the magnitude of what had happened. Unsure where else to turn, Aviana called her close friend Thea Loxley, who worked in a different department at Ridgemont. Though she couldn't bring herself to reveal Langston's involvement, she needed at least some support. Thea urged her to visit a doctor as soon as possible, so Aviana scheduled an early appointment, doing everything she could to keep the matter confidential. The doctor's confirmation made it official: she was pregnant, and by every estimation, the timing traced back to that single night with Langston Harlow. In the privacy of the exam room, Aviana struggled with equal parts awe and dread. She thought of her growing career, her limited finances, and the reality that her baby's father was the most powerful man she knew. On her way home from the clinic, Aviana's mind whirled with possible outcomes. Should she tell Langston immediately, risking his anger or, worse, his rejection? Or should she keep the pregnancy to herself, at least until she could figure out how to stand on her own 2 feet? Each option seemed fraught with complications, and she spent a sleepless night wondering if there was any right choice at all. By dawn, she had resolved to remain silent for now. But as she got dressed for work, she felt a new weight pressing on her, the weight of a secret that could not stay buried forever. Her reflection in the mirror showed the same face, yet she knew everything about her life had changed. There was no going back to the way things were, no matter how desperately she wished she could. Aviana managed to push through her daily responsibilities by sheer willpower, but the strain of keeping her condition a secret became harder each day. She would arrive at the Ridgemont Industries office early, carefully choosing loose-fitting blouses or flowing dresses in muted colors that might hide the first signs of her growing belly. Beneath her calm exterior, her mind whirled with anxiety. Each morning, she forced herself to endure brief waves of nausea in the restroom before stepping onto the polished marble floors and nodding at coworkers who hardly suspected she was grappling with life-altering news. She began to notice every passing glance, every subtle shift in her colleagues' expressions, wondering if anyone could guess the truth by her changing body or by the perpetual worry in her eyes. Celia Fallon, her strict supervisor, appeared to be watching her more closely. Aviana told herself this was mere paranoia, but the fear lingered. Whenever Celia asked if she felt unwell, Aviana would offer an excuse about a mild cold or allergy season. It was a balancing act, trying to perform well enough to keep her job yet remaining inconspicuous enough to avoid deeper scrutiny. The only solace she found was in brief lunches with Thea Loxley, who was beginning to suspect there might be more behind Aviana's tired smile than she let on. On days when Langston Harlow passed her in the corridor, Aviana's heart hammered so loudly she was amazed he couldn't hear it. He would give a polite nod or a quick, professional greeting, revealing no trace of the memory that haunted her nights. Yet every time he looked at her, even in a routine business setting, she felt a flicker of that same connection they had shared in his office. Her guilt and longing intertwined, making it increasingly painful to face him. She had considered telling him the truth, but she recalled all too clearly the boardroom politics, the swirl of rumors that could arise if anyone learned she was carrying the CEO's child. The scandal would threaten her career and potentially tarnish his name. Every scenario she imagined ended in disaster. One weekend, Aviana finally allowed herself to admit she couldn't continue living on the edge like this. She spent hours in her small apartment, hunched over her laptop, updating her resume and searching for any position that might offer her a quieter environment away from the high-stakes corporate world. Late that night, she sent out several applications, each time feeling a twinge of regret for abandoning the role she had worked so hard to earn. Yet a deeper instinct pushed her forward. She needed a stable, less demanding path before her pregnancy became impossible to conceal. Meanwhile, she avoided Thea's gentle questions, determined to keep Langston from discovering the truth through anyone else. When she received a promising reply from a small consulting firm across town, Aviana decided to hand in her resignation. The next day, she slipped a typed letter under Celia Fallon's office door, explaining in carefully measured language that she had to attend to personal matters and regrettably could no longer continue her employment. She didn't provide details, nor did she mention her future plans. In a final email to Human Resources, she thanked Ridgemont Industries for the opportunity and closed by stating she hoped their paths would cross again someday. Packing her desk at night, she felt a bittersweet pang in her chest. She thought about the bright, ambitious woman she had been when she first walked in here, brimming with goals and unaware of how quickly her life would pivot. Only a few silent employees remained when she exited the building for the last time. The city lights glimmered on the glass panels above her, and she paused in the lobby, recalling how she had once dreamed of advancing in this powerful corporation. As she stepped out into the cool air, she ran a hand protectively over her lower abdomen, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. She was on her own now, but at least she had made a decision that allowed her a moment to breathe. She had no idea if she was choosing the right path, or if fate would pull her back toward the man who had set all of this in motion. For the first time in weeks, however, she felt the smallest glimmer of relief. At least, she told herself, she had a chance to rewrite her future on her own terms. Aviana settled into a modest new routine, grateful to have found a position at a small consulting firm where no one seemed to ask intrusive questions. She still rose early every morning, but now her commute led her to a cramped office suite on the outskirts of the city rather than the towering skyscraper she had grown accustomed to. The firm specialized in advising local businesses on budgeting and marketing strategies, which meant the pace was slower and the projects less cutthroat. For Aviana, it felt like a chance to breathe. She spent her days combing through client data, typing up proposals, and answering the phone with a polite, practiced tone that did little to betray the tumult unfolding in her personal life. She was nearing the end of her first trimester, and her growing belly, while still slight, became more difficult to conceal with each passing week. Whenever she caught her reflection in the office bathroom mirror, she noted subtle changes in her body and face. The usually flawless complexion beneath her cheekbones had grown a little paler, and fatigue settled in her eyes no matter how many hours she slept. She worried constantly that a coworker might notice the way her blouses fit more snugly now, or how she sometimes excused herself to lie down on the worn sofa in the break room during lunch. Yet she persisted, reluctant to draw any attention that could jeopardize the stability she had only just managed to secure. Nighttime was the hardest. After riding the bus back to her small apartment, Aviana often sank onto the couch and stared at the silent walls, wondering if she was making the right choices. She had no family in the city and only a distant relationship with her parents, who believed she was merely chasing the ambition she'd always confessed to having. In truth, she was too afraid to share the news with anyone else, unsure of how they would react. Guilt gnawed at her whenever she allowed herself to think of Langston. She imagined telling him the truth, yet each scenario played out in her mind with disastrous consequences. Maybe he would assume she wanted money, or worse, he would offer a transactional arrangement. The idea of complicating his life felt wrong, and she despised the possibility of becoming another scandal in the rumor mill of Ridgemont Industries. Despite her decision to remain silent, a part of her yearned for some acknowledgement of what had happened between them. Now and then, she found herself scrolling through news updates about Langston's business deals, reading brief mentions of him in financial columns. Her emotions seesawed between longing and relief whenever she saw his name. She had left to protect herself, and the life growing inside her, but she couldn't deny that a quiet ache settled in her chest each time she recalled the gentleness in his eyes that night. In those moments, she consoled herself with the thought that soon, she would be too busy with a newborn to dwell on how different her life might have been. For now, she willed herself to push forward, one day at a time, hopeful that her chosen path would keep both her and her secret safe for just a little longer. Aviana's second trimester brought an undeniable shift in her life, one that stretched far beyond the subtle changes in her body. She had grown more accustomed to the rhythmic hum of the small consulting firm where she worked, content in the knowledge that its slower pace offered fewer prying eyes and less office gossip. Yet as the weeks passed, her expanding waistline became impossible to overlook, forcing her to strategically choose cardigans and loose-fit dresses that might buy her another few days before anyone asked uncomfortable questions. She counted each discreet glance her colleagues threw her way, certain they must be wondering about her increasingly frequent breaks and slightly altered figure. A flicker of paranoia danced through her thoughts each time she felt the baby move, as though someone might sense the life growing inside her just by passing close in the hallway. Most evenings, Aviana returned to her tiny apartment feeling exhausted in body and spirit. The modest paycheck from her new position barely covered the essentials, and the stress of impending motherhood made her painfully aware of every dollar spent. Nights were the hardest, when she found herself missing the sense of purpose she had enjoyed at Ridgemont Industries. More than once, she struggled with the question of whether she had given up too quickly. The memory of Langston remained a constant undercurrent in her mind, a swirl of confusion, longing, and guilt. She had no illusions about them ever truly being a couple, but part of her ached to let him know about the child and see whether his reaction might be more compassionate than she feared. It was in one of these lonely stretches between dinner and bedtime that the phone rang with an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, afraid it might be a creditor or a pushy telemarketer. On the third ring, she gathered her courage and answered, only to hear a breathless voice she recognized instantly, Thea Loxley. Aviana's grip tightened on the phone, her heart pounding as Thea explained she'd reached out a few times before and was worried by Aviana's prolonged silence. After a moment of hesitation, Aviana admitted she had left Ridgemont Industries for personal reasons. Thea grew quiet, then gently asked if Aviana was well. She could hear the genuine concern in her friend's tone, and it nearly brought tears to her eyes. In a rush of impulsive trust, Aviana invited Thea to come over for tea the next evening, torn between the urge to confide in someone at last and the fear of letting her secret spill into the open. By the time Thea arrived, Aviana's nerves were frayed. She busied herself setting out mismatched mugs and a plate of store-bought cookies, aware that the small living room looked sparse compared to the upscale apartment she had once envisioned for herself. Thea took it all in with a sympathetic smile, noticing how Aviana's exhaustion shadowed her features. They talked for a while about harmless topics, Thea's workload at Ridgemont, the new CFO who had come in to oversee a major restructuring, the lofty projects that Aviana used to help with. But the conversation inevitably circled back to the elephant in the room. "You don't look ill," Thea said at last, searching Aviana's face. "But you're different. I can't explain it, but something about you feels heavier. Sadder." She paused, her eyes flicking to Aviana's midsection. "Are you?" Aviana felt her heart jolt as she realized Thea was on the verge of asking the very question she had worked so hard to hide. Without a word, Aviana rested a hand against the gentle curve of her stomach. It was the first time she had done so in front of someone else, almost as if her body were speaking before her mind could intervene. A flicker of shock registered on Thea's face, followed by an immediate rush of empathy. "I am," Aviana said, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant." Thea's eyes widened, but her expression held no judgment. She reached out and squeezed Aviana's hand, and for a moment, neither spoke. It was a simple gesture of understanding, yet it unraveled Aviana's tight composure. Tears she had held back for weeks finally broke free, and she explained in broken sentences how she had felt trapped, how she feared what might happen if anyone discovered the truth, and how she simply couldn't bear to stay at Ridgemont once she realized the baby was Langston's. "So Langston," Thea began softly, trailing off in thought. "Does he know?" Aviana shook her head, a mixture of shame and uncertainty burning in her cheeks. She confessed how often she had wrestled with the idea of telling him, imagining scenarios both disastrous and hopeful, none of which seemed remotely real. She was terrified that he might offer only financial support, or worse, that he might think she was trying to trap him. Yet a small part of her clung to the memory of their shared warmth on that fateful night, wondering if he would be kinder than she dared to believe. Thea's eyes filled with sympathy. "Aviana, you have to consider the possibility that he might care. I know Langston can seem ruthless in the boardroom, but he's not heartless. If you never give him a chance, you'll never really know." Aviana felt the truth of Thea's words, but her mind reeled with the potential fallout. She pictured gossip spreading through the corridors of Ridgemont, the tabloids feasting on the personal drama of a billionaire CEO and his former subordinate. For several minutes, the two women sat in silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Aviana took a shaky breath and nodded, though her resolve was far from certain. She wasn't ready to break the silence she had kept so steadfastly, yet Thea's concern ignited a spark of courage in her. Maybe she owed it to herself, and to her child, to consider all the possibilities, even if that meant confronting her deepest fears. After Thea left, Aviana looked around her small apartment with new eyes. She didn't have the luxuries she once thought necessary for happiness, but she had survived on her own thus far, providing a humble kind of stability for the life growing within her. Taking out a notebook, she jotted down the pros and cons of telling Langston. The list hardly brought clarity, each side seemed riddled with emotional landmines. She closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest, feeling her heartbeat race as she whispered quietly to herself. There would be no simple answers, no easy path forward. Yet for the first time since leaving Ridgemont, she allowed herself a fragile sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face it all alone. In the days following Thea's visit, Aviana found herself wrestling with an inner turmoil that seemed to grow more intense with each passing hour. The small consulting firm had entered a slow period, leaving her with idle moments to dwell on her indecision. She would be typing up a proposal or reviewing sales data only to pause and stare off into space, thinking about the list she had scribbled into her notebook. The reasons to tell Langston balanced precariously against the crushing fears of what might happen if she did. More than once she caught herself running a hand over her belly, feeling the subtle movements of the baby and silently wondering which choice was truly right. One evening, Aviana dozed off on her couch with the television mutely flickering in the background. She dreamed of walking through the corridors of Ridgemont Industries again, only everything was slightly off. Lights were dim, and the offices stood empty except for one, Langston's. In the dream, she could see him through the glass walls, flipping through documents, looking harried and weighed down by unspoken concerns. She knocked, but the door wouldn't open. He didn't turn around. She woke with a jolt, her heart pounding, a thin sheen of sweat clinging to her temples. Shoving off the blanket draped over her legs, she realized that even in her unconscious mind, she couldn't escape thoughts of him. Later that week, Thea called with a hint of excitement in her voice. She had managed to land an invitation to a small weekend gathering thrown by one of Ridgemont's board members. It was less formal than a corporate event, more like a social mixer in a sprawling suburban home. Thea insisted that Aviana come along as her guest. At first, Aviana balked at the idea. She was in no mood to face old colleagues or risk running into someone who might notice her pregnancy. But Thea's reasoning was persuasive. If Aviana wanted a chance to talk to Langston in a setting that wasn't the coldly lit, power-driven atmosphere of the boardroom, this might be it. He might not even show, Thea admitted, but there's a chance. And if he does, it'll be a more relaxed environment than the office. Reluctant yet swayed by the possibility of gaining the courage she needed, Aviana found herself rummaging through her closet Saturday afternoon in search of a suitable dress. Everything she owned either felt a size too tight or looked too businesslike. Her heart pounded as she pulled on a flowing, dark blue dress that skimmed the gentle curve of her stomach, noticeable if someone looked closely, but not glaringly obvious if she was careful. She took a cab to the quiet, upscale neighborhood, stepping out onto a tree-lined street dotted with expensive cars and manicured lawns. Already she felt out of place, a jolt of nerves making her stomach flutter. She clutched a small wrap around herself as though it could hide not just her belly, but her entire secret. The home was breathtaking, with twinkling lights illuminating a wide patio and an open set of French doors leading to the interior. Thea met her at the entrance, wearing a stylish cocktail dress and a reassuring smile. Aviana could hear laughter and conversation rolling in waves from the living room, where a small cluster of people mingled with glasses of champagne and fancy hors d'oeuvres. She recognized a few faces, former colleagues who nodded politely but seemed preoccupied with their own discussions. Anxiety coiled tighter in her gut, but Thea grabbed her hand and gently guided her through the crowd. She wasn't sure if relief or disappointment coursed through her when she realized Langston wasn't in the main room. She spotted a couple of Ridgemont's high-level executives, men and women known for cutthroat deals, but there was no sign of the CEO himself. Thea shrugged and leaned in, whispering that perhaps he wasn't coming after all. Aviana tried to dismiss the pang of conflicting emotions. Part of her was relieved she wouldn't be forced into an awkward confrontation, yet another part, one she barely wanted to acknowledge, ached at the thought of not seeing him. Then, just as she was beginning to relax, he appeared. Langston slipped in through the back patio, his tie slightly loosened, scanning the room with an air of quiet confidence. Aviana's breath caught in her throat. It felt surreal to stand there, hidden behind a cluster of chatting guests, watching him greet the host. Under the soft glow of the overhead lights, he looked every bit the self-assured billionaire she remembered, focused, charming in that understated way, and completely at ease in this environment. She was struck by how simultaneously near and distant he felt. This was the man she had once shared a deeply intimate night with, a night that changed her life forever. Yet here, he was a figure of authority and affluence, surrounded by people who hung on his every word. Before Aviana could steel herself, Thea gave her a nudge, as if to say, "This is your moment." Feeling her cheeks burn, Aviana took a shaky breath and wove through the small throng toward him. Halfway across the room, a group of board members intercepted Langston, launching into an excited discussion about future expansions. Aviana waited uncertainly, hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. A part of her wanted to flee, but she stayed rooted in place, reminding herself that she wouldn't get another easy opportunity to talk with him face to face. At last, Langston finished his polite exchange and turned slightly to find Aviana standing just a few feet away. It took a second for recognition to light his features, but when it did, she saw a brief flicker of surprise cross his eyes. Quickly, he composed himself, inclining his head in greeting as though she were just another acquaintance. A hush descended in Aviana's mind. It was as if time slowed, the noise of the party dulled by the sudden pounding of her heart. She managed a soft hello, feeling every bit of her composure slip the moment he returned it in that deep, steady voice. His gaze swept over her, lingering briefly on her form, and she wondered if he noticed the subtle fullness of her figure, the small but undeniable curve at her midsection. They stepped aside, drifting toward an unoccupied corner of the room where the lighting was calmer and the voices of other guests formed a distant murmur. At first, the conversation between them felt strained and formal. He asked about her new job, she offered vague answers. He mentioned that Ridgemont had been busy with restructuring, and she nodded politely. Beneath the surface, Aviana could sense the same current she had felt the last time they were alone, that emotional undercurrent that felt too large to contain in small talk. Each time she tried to gather the courage to speak, her words got lodged in her throat. The tension between them thickened until, finally, Langston exhaled as though giving up on the pretense. His posture shifted, and the businessman mask slipped just enough for a flash of earnest concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, and she saw that genuine worry behind his eyes. "You left Ridgemont so abruptly." I should have reached out sooner, but I respected your decision to move on. I just want to be sure you're well." Her stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to believe he truly cared, yet her fear of revealing everything loomed like a dark cloud. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she realized her breathing had grown shallow. She blamed it on the tightness of her dress and the stifling heat in the crowded house, but in truth, it was the pressure of 1,000 unspoken words crushing her chest. She looked into his eyes, took a single trembling breath, and opened her mouth to speak. Before she could utter a single sentence, an elegantly dressed guest sidled up to Langston, smiling brightly and begging for his input on a lucrative business venture. The moment broke. Langston turned to politely engage the newcomer, flicking an apologetic glance in Aviana's direction. Feeling the clarity slip through her fingers, she nodded mutely and stepped away, unable to compete with the demands on his attention. Her heart sank. This gathering had been the perfect chance to say something, anything, about her pregnancy, about how their single night had changed her life. And once again, circumstance intervened, leaving her with her secret unspoken. She retreated to Thea's side, her pulse still hammering. For the rest of the evening, she kept her distance from Langston, sneaking occasional glances only to find him occupied in conversation or disappearing into another part of the house. By the time Thea was ready to leave, Aviana felt drained, both physically and emotionally. They walked out onto the dimly lit lawn, breathing in the cool night air, and Thea murmured a soft apology. Aviana simply shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. All the way home, Aviana replayed the moment in her mind. She wasn't sure which was worse, never seeing him again, or seeing him and failing to tell him the truth about the child that would soon enter the world. As the car pulled up to her apartment building, she realized that regardless of her confusion and fear, she couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, the truth would have to come out, even if it meant facing the deepest anxiety she had about his reaction. She stepped out of the car, arms wrapped protectively around her belly, and gazed up at her darkened window. Resolving to find a way to speak to him properly, she whispered a silent promise to the child growing inside her. She would find the courage to let Langston know he was going to be a father, and she would do it before fate stole that chance away again. Aviana spent the next week in a haze of conflicting emotions after that brief, unfulfilled encounter at the board members' gathering. It felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, summoned by the urgent need to reveal her secret, yet paralyzed by fear of the consequences. Her belly had grown more pronounced, making it increasingly difficult to mask her pregnancy with loose-fitting clothing. She had just started her 6th month, and every day brought new physical reminders, a sharper kick from within, a surge of fatigue, bouts of insomnia that left her staring at the ceiling in the pre-dawn hours. Each reminder also brought renewed anxiety. If she didn't tell Langston soon, she risked him finding out through someone else, or worse, discovering it by chance in a far more humiliating way. In that state of worried indecision, she tried to focus on her work at the consulting firm, poring over reports and drafting proposals that rarely captured her full attention. Whenever she glanced at the clock, her thoughts drifted to Langston. Was he in a meeting with important clients? Going over some high-stakes investment strategy? Did he ever recall that long, quiet night they had shared, or was it a distant blur for him? Most tormenting of all was the question of how he would react if she simply walked into his office and told him everything. She must have composed half a dozen imaginary speeches in her head, each scenario ending with her heart thrashing in her chest. By Wednesday, a restless energy took hold of her. She sat at her desk, unable to concentrate on the spreadsheet glaring back at her. Finally, she decided to take her lunch break early and slipped outside. The city was in the throes of an unseasonably warm spell, the sidewalks filled with people eager to soak up a bit of sun. Aviana wandered aimlessly, eventually ending up at a small park with a few benches scattered around a fountain. Sitting down, she watched the water arc in the sunlight, droplets glimmering in the air before tumbling down into the basin. She let her hand rest on her stomach, feeling the baby's gentle movements. Tears pricked at her eyes, triggered by the swirl of uncertainty in her mind. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly missed the gentle call of her name. Glancing up, she saw Thea, who was out on a quick lunch errand of her own, holding a paper bag and wearing a look of mild surprise. After exchanging greetings, Thea joined her on the bench, setting the bag between them. For a moment, neither said anything. Aviana suspected her friend could sense the emotional weight she carried like a storm cloud overhead. Eventually, Thea broke the silence, asking how Aviana felt after the unsuccessful attempt to speak with Langston at the party. Aviana bit her lip, forced to admit that she had done nothing since that night except avoid the issue. Thea let out a soft sigh and reached over to squeeze her hand. "You won't get another chance unless you make one," Thea said, her voice calm but firm. "Look, I understand how overwhelming it is. You want to protect your peace and your child's future. But every day you hesitate is another day you're living in fear. I don't say this to push you into something you're not ready for, but to remind you that you hold more power than you think." Aviana stared at her friend, a realization dawning in her mind. She wondered if part of her reluctance stemmed from a deep-rooted sense of unworthiness. She recalled how she'd always admired Langston from afar for his ambition and brilliance, never daring to believe she might be part of his world. But now her circumstances weren't just about her, they were about the life she carried. That thought shored up her resolve, if only a little. The next day, she took a bold step, pulling out her phone and drafting a concise text message to Langston. She wrote, then rewrote it multiple times, agonizing over every word. In its final form, the message read, "Langston, I know this may come as a surprise, but I need to see you. It's important. Could we meet somewhere outside the office, Aviana?" It felt painfully vague and vulnerable, but she pressed send before she could talk herself out of it. The hours after she sent the message were excruciating. She kept glancing at her phone, half expecting an immediate response, but the screen stayed dark. By the time she dragged herself home that evening, there was still no reply. She cooked a small dinner she had no appetite for, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread. She told herself he was a busy man, maybe he was traveling on business or tied up in a late board meeting. She clung to that explanation until her phone finally chimed close to midnight. Heart pounding, she fumbled for it and saw a short text, "I'll be in touch soon." That was all he wrote. No apology, no hint of curiosity, no suggestion of a place to meet. Aviana read the message again, unsure if "soon" was a promise or a dismissal. She tried to sleep that night with those scant words echoing in her thoughts, the baby rolling and shifting within her, as though sensing her inner turmoil. Days ticked by in tense silence. Each time her phone buzzed, her stomach lurched, only for her to see a telemarketing number or an update from Thea. She felt foolish for pinning her hopes on one cryptic text, yet she couldn't extinguish a faint glimmer of optimism that perhaps Langston was planning his response carefully. By the time another weekend arrived, she'd managed to convince herself that if he truly intended to meet, he would have done it by now. She tried to bury her disappointment beneath a flurry of domestic tasks, cleaning her cramped apartment, catching up on laundry, reorganizing the few baby items she had bought. Still, the waiting gnawed at her. Late Sunday afternoon, as a warm drizzle pattered against her windows, there was a sudden knock at the door. Aviana's heart leapt into her throat. She smoothed her shirt, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and prepared herself for the possibility that Langston might be standing on the other side. But the face that greeted her belonged to someone else entirely, a tall woman with sleek hair and an impeccably tailored suit, rain droplets clinging to her shoulders. She introduced herself as Eleanor Royce, an associate counsel at Ridgemont Industries. Aviana blinked in confusion. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor hesitated, glancing around the dim hallway before politely asking to come inside. Aviana stepped back, dread pooling in her stomach. Why would a legal representative be at her doorstep? She guided Eleanor into her small living room, where the woman stood, scanning the space with calm detachment. After a moment of disconcerting silence, Eleanor explained that she was visiting on behalf of Langston Harlow, who wished to confirm a few pieces of information related to Aviana's former employment. The words came out too smoothly, too practiced. Aviana felt her chest tighten. She suspected that this was no ordinary check-in. When Eleanor's questions became oddly personal, about the timeline of Aviana's departure, her health insurance, even her current medical situation, Aviana's pulse surged. She answered in halting tones, uncertain how much she should reveal. Her greatest fear in that moment was that Langston had discovered her pregnancy through corporate paperwork or rumors, and instead of meeting her himself, he had sent a legal envoy to gather evidence. Eleanor's polite veneer and the crisp folder she carried only intensified Aviana's sense of vulnerability. As the woman politely thanked her for her time and turned to leave, Aviana finally found the courage to ask the question burning in her mind: why exactly is Mr. Harlow curious about my situation now? He hasn't contacted me directly, aside from a short message. Eleanor paused at the threshold. Her expression was unreadable, but a flicker of compassion crossed her features. "I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss the details. Mr. Harlow asked me to ensure that all matters pertaining to your departure from Ridgemont Industries were in order. If you have concerns, I recommend addressing them with him personally." The statement felt chillingly formal, like a door slamming shut. With that, Eleanor departed, leaving Aviana standing in the narrow entryway, her heart racing and thoughts spiraling. She stared at the closed door, replaying the terse conversation in her head. Nothing about it had felt right. If Langston truly intended to speak with her, why send an attorney to her doorstep like this? A cold sense of betrayal pooled in her veins. She wondered if maybe Langston suspected something, and rather than handle it face to face, he was moving into damage control mode. Perhaps he already believed Aviana intended to make claims on his fortune or threaten him with a public scandal. The idea made her feel sick. She clutched at the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to steady herself, tears of frustration burning at the corners of her eyes. That night, sleep eluded her again. She paced her living room, her arms folded protectively over the child she carried, grappling with the realization that she had to act soon or risk losing any semblance of control over how the truth came to light. Her baby's future hung in the balance, and it terrified her to think that Langston might handle this news as a corporate liability rather than a profound, life-changing event. Eventually, she sank into her couch and dug out her phone, scrolling through contact after contact until she found Langston's name. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Could she handle the conversation if he was cold or dismissive? Would she find the right words if he accused her of trying to ensnare him? In the end, she forced herself to press dial. The phone rang endlessly before going to voicemail. Aviana's heart pounded, and she left a brief, shaky message: "Langston, please call me back. It can't wait. I need to speak to you in person." Hanging up, She set the phone down and buried her face in her hands, a soft sob escaping her lips. She felt trapped, powerless against the forces swirling around her. Yet through the panic, there rose a flicker of fierce determination. Regardless of the corporate moves or the misunderstandings, this was her life and her child's life. She wasn't going to let anyone, no lawyer, no board member, and not even Langston Harlow himself, reduce that to a mere detail in a contract. If he refused to meet her as one human being to another, she would find another way to stand her ground. With that thought in mind, she exhaled a trembling breath, vowing that if Langston didn't give her the chance to speak the truth directly, she would pursue him until he had no choice but to hear it. Aviana scarcely slept after leaving that urgent voicemail for Langston. Every ticking second felt like an eternity, and by the time she finally drifted off, the early morning light was already filtering through the thin curtains of her living room. When she awoke with a start, her phone was still silent. No texts, no calls. She stared at the blank screen, a storm of dread roiling in her stomach. The baby stirred, a flutter that felt like a reminder, she was running out of time to keep her secret on her own terms. That morning, she pushed herself through her routine at the consulting firm, though she barely registered the documents she was supposed to finalize. Her colleagues, accustomed to her recent bouts of distraction, largely left her alone. By noon, she realized she couldn't continue functioning on autopilot. Grabbing her bag and laptop, she told her manager she had to take a personal day, ignoring the raised eyebrows that followed her out the door. As Aviana stepped into the crisp air, a surge of determination propelled her to hail a taxi. She gave the driver the address of the Ridgemont Industries headquarters, a building she had once walked into with so much hope. During the ride, she clutched her phone in trembling hands, half praying Langston would call and end this twisting uncertainty. But the phone remained silent. The city's skyline loomed closer with every passing minute, until at last the familiar imposing tower of Ridgemont Industries came into view. The bustling lobby was both comforting and unsettling. Suited employees hurried past the gleaming floors, eyes on phones or watch faces, too preoccupied to notice her. Aviana hesitated before approaching the security desk. She used to stride through these halls with a company badge clipped to her blouse, belonging here in her own small way. Now she was a stranger, reliant on the mercy of a guard who seemed reluctant to let her upstairs. She cleared her throat, steeling her nerves, and explained that she needed to speak with Langston Harlow directly, that it was a personal matter. Her request met an impassive stare. "Do you have an appointment?" the guard asked. "No," Aviana replied, forcing her voice not to shake. "But please let him know Aviana Wren is here to see him. He'll want to speak with me." She wasn't entirely convinced that last statement was true, but she had to try. The guard, bored and somewhat skeptical, made a phone call. The minutes stretched painfully as Aviana clutched the strap of her bag, her nerves firing all at once. At last, the guard hung up with a shrug. "He's in a meeting," he said flatly, "but you can wait." And so she did. Aviana found a seat near a stark, modern sculpture in the lobby, fiddling with her phone and trying not to imagine the worst. Every so often, an executive or someone from legal would pass by, glancing her way with mild curiosity. She reminded herself to breathe, aware that her pulse thudded against her temples. The baby seemed to sense her unease, rolling and kicking with restless energy. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, the elevator doors parted, and Eleanor Royce, the same associate counsel who had appeared at Aviana's apartment, stepped into the lobby with measured strides. Her expression was as guarded as ever, but Aviana thought she saw a flicker of hesitation in Eleanor's eyes. "Ms. Wren," she greeted smoothly, "Mr. Harlow is occupied at the moment. Is there something I can do to assist you?" Aviana's jaw set. "I left him a message days ago," she said, her voice hushed but firm. "I need to see him in person. It's not a matter for lawyers." Eleanor's lips thinned, and she gave a small sigh. "Let me check with him again. Wait here." A few more agonizing minutes ticked by. Aviana thought she would explode from anxiety. But then Eleanor returned, gesturing for Aviana to follow her to a set of secure elevators that required a special keycard. They ascended swiftly toward the top floor, each ding of passing levels ratcheting up the tension. Once the doors opened, Eleanor led Aviana down a hushed corridor lined with frosted glass. They stopped outside a set of double doors. "He's inside," Eleanor said, voice subdued. "I'll give you privacy, but please bear in mind that Mr. Harlow is under considerable pressure right now. Keep this conversation as succinct as possible." Though the warning stung, Aviana nodded. Her heart hammered as she watched Eleanor walk away. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she eased open the door. The office was as grand as she remembered, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping city view. Langston stood by a large desk littered with files and a sleek laptop, his posture tense as he looked out over the skyscrapers. He turned at the sound of the door, his gaze locking on Aviana. For a moment, neither spoke. She was struck by how tired he looked, faint circles under his eyes, the normally pristine lines of his suit slightly rumpled. "Aviana," he said at last, his tone revealing a swirl of surprise and something else she couldn't quite name. She stepped forward, carefully closing the door behind her. "I've been trying to reach you," she murmured, acutely aware of the corners of her blouse pulling over her bump. Langston's gaze flicked downward, and she saw the subtle widening of his eyes as realization dawned. His breathing seemed to catch. She felt as though the room itself had grown smaller. When he finally spoke, it was with measured calm. "I know. I'm sorry. Things have been complicated. The board, the new legal challenges, expansions. I asked Eleanor to handle a few checks on past employees." His explanation faltered as Aviana brought a hand to her stomach, unconsciously protective. "So you sent your lawyer to my home, unannounced," she said. There was an edge of betrayal in her voice, though she fought to keep it controlled. "I thought we were better than that." A brief flash of regret crossed Langston's features. "I wasn't sure how to proceed," he admitted, stepping around the desk. "I didn't want to make assumptions. But then rumors started circulating, and I'd heard you were not well when you left, and I needed facts. I needed the truth. His voice caught again as his eyes rested on her abdomen. Tension crackled in the air. Aviana exhaled shakily, bracing herself for what she had come to do. "I'm pregnant, Langston." "It's yours," she said plainly, letting the words fall between them like stones into a still pond. "I didn't tell you sooner because I was afraid. Afraid of your reaction, afraid of how the company would treat me, afraid of what people would say. But I can't hide this anymore. I won't." A hush settled, broken only by the muted hum of the city beyond the glass. Langston's eyes flashed with something akin to alarm, but not anger. In fact, she was startled to see genuine concern carving lines across his brow. "How long have you known?" he asked softly. "Since shortly after I left Ridgemont," Aviana replied, folding her arms across the swell of her belly. "I wanted to tell you. I almost did. But every time I found the nerve, fear got in the way." She paused, her voice quavering. "I'm not here to beg for anything. I thought you had the right to know." She felt tears prick her eyes, mortified that she might break down in front of him. But as she blinked them away, Langston stepped closer, the severity of his expression softening. He reached out, hesitating a moment before touching her arm. "Aviana," he breathed, voice heavy with emotion, "I had suspicions, but I didn't want to invade your privacy. I handled it badly, sending Eleanor. For that, I'm sorry." His hand fell to his side, and he seemed at a loss for words, something Aviana had never witnessed before. Finally, he inhaled unsteadily, as if steeling himself for a transformation in his life he hadn't planned. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I can't pretend this isn't a shock. But I'm glad I know." Aviana managed a small, wavering smile, relief mingling with lingering anxiety. "So what now?" she asked in a soft voice. "Is this going to be a PR nightmare for you? For Ridgemont?" Langston's jaw clenched. "I won't let the board or the press turn our child into some scandal," he said firmly. "That's not negotiable. But this isn't just about public image. It's about you and me. About the baby. I want to do what's right, for all of us." She heard the sincerity in his tone, saw the gravity in his eyes. Unsure how to respond, she pressed her hand gently against the place where the baby shifted, offering a silent reassurance. "I spent so long imagining you'd be angry or dismissive," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "I was afraid you'd think I was using this to leverage a payout or something worse." A pained look crossed his face. "I'm sorry if my actions ever gave you that impression," he said, stepping closer again. "I won't lie, this changes everything. But I promise you, I'm not going to treat you like a liability. You matter to me, Aviana. And so does our child." Emotion swelled in her chest, relief, lingering fear, maybe even a cautious hope. Yet she couldn't suppress the memory of how alone she had felt these past months. "Words are one thing," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "But I need to see action, Langston. I can't handle more half-truths or evasions. And I won't accept being sidelined by your company's legal team or forced into some quiet arrangement." He hesitated, then inclined his head. "I understand. And you have my word, I'll be transparent with you. Let me figure out how to handle this with the board. I don't want you feeling trapped or worried about your privacy. You're carrying my child, Aviana. You deserve my respect and honesty." She breathed a trembling sigh, feeling a burden lift even as new uncertainties crowded her mind. At least now, the truth was out. No more lies, no more hiding. They stood there together in a silence that felt both fragile and strangely comforting. The sun shone through the high windows, gilding the edges of the desk where they had once worked late into the night. She couldn't help recalling that intimate evening when they first crossed the line between boss and employee. So much had led them here, to this turning point. Langston's voice broke the quiet. "Would you let me walk you out? We can talk more in private. Somewhere that isn't under the scrutiny of 1,000 eyes." She gave a tentative nod. As they left the office, passing the watchful glance of Eleanor in the corridor, Aviana couldn't help but feel a flicker of defiance. She was done letting corporate whispers dictate her life. Langston hovered protectively at her side as they took the elevator down, a subtle but telling gesture that signaled he was prepared to stand by her rather than hide her away. When they reached the lobby, the hush of that grand space enveloped them again. This time, however, Aviana felt a subtle shift in the dynamic. They emerged as two people bound by a secret they had finally brought to the surface. She was still anxious, still unsure of the long road ahead, but there was a sense of possibility she hadn't dared feel before. They stepped out onto the busy sidewalk, the noise of the city washing over them. Langston turned to her, an apologetic light in his eyes. "Can I take you somewhere to talk? A quiet cafe, a restaurant, wherever you're comfortable. Or if you'd prefer, I can order in at my place." Aviana sensed the sincerity in his offer, the silent plea not to vanish again before they could find a path forward. The thought of going to his private residence made her chest tighten, too many intimate memories might resurface. But she knew they needed time to speak freely, away from the curious stares of Ridgemont employees or the possibility of paparazzi. Eventually, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go somewhere neutral, somewhere calm." Langston motioned for his driver, and Aviana slid into the back seat of the sleek car, feeling the baby shift again as she settled into the plush leather. She watched through the tinted window as the Ridgemont Tower receded into the skyline. 1,000 unknowns loomed ahead, from how the board would react to whether the press would catch wind of this story. Yet in that moment, she focused on what was tangible and immediate, the warmth of her child moving within her and the determined expression on Langston's face as he sat beside her. They might have started in secrecy and fear, but now, that secrecy was broken. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with open eyes and honest words. And for Aviana, that was enough to kindle a fragile sense of hope that this man, once just her brilliant, unreachable boss, might now become something far more meaningful in her life and in the life of the child they had created together.